let's talk through every Tyranid creature great and small, from scurrying space swarms to burrowing nightmares and great brain bugs, with an overview of some of the strengths and weaknesses of every Tyranid's unit. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video I thought we'd do a complete tour through the Codex, talking through every single unit in the book, some of their strengths and weaknesses on the tabletop, and for each unit giving them a very rough and ready power score out of 10. Absolutely loads to talk through with the great variety that the Hive Mind has on offer. For this one we'll go through the Codex starting with the swarming endless multitudes, then the other infantry and beast units, then talking about the monsters including the great big Forge World ones, and then finishing up with the Tyranid character units. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, and starting with Battleline units, we've got the Tyranid Termagants, these guys being the lesser drones of the Hive, sent in with their gruesome flesh borers to weigh down the enemy through weight of numbers. They're a Battleline infantry unit with 60 points for 10 of them and 120 for 20. That gets you a toughness 3 gaunt body with a 5+ save. They've got good objective control, and having that many bodies means that you at least need some volume fire to clear the units. For their weapon options, their Spine Fists in particular have got some good damage against lighter targets. The combination of Assault, Twin Linked and Pistol keywords are all really good things. And they can have a few special weapons in the unit, maybe the Strangle Web with the devastating wounds being the most interesting there. Otherwise, for advantages, they quite enjoy the replenishing gaunt stratagem that you have in the invasion fleets. Quite nice to be able to have squads ping back all the way up towards full health for really not all that much investment. They can also do that with a Turvagon if you had a mind to build big into them. And the Datasheet special rule is quite a nice one, a reactive move to allow them to basically back away from enemies or maybe hide safe behind terrain, or potentially even move up and block the way to other targets. They can be nice enough as a cheap expendable unit to skirmish for the midboard, putting good OC to work on midboard objectives. For their downsides, they do have low damage output against anything but light infantry. A few lethal hits and twin links don't really change that too much, though at least they can grind away at things if they can survive. I feel like their weapon balance isn't particularly awesome. The flesh borers feel a bit inferior to those spine fists, and it's a bit of a shame for them that as one of the central units for the unending swarm, that detachment focused around the endless multitudes is quite weak right now. Overall, I feel like they're usable enough. I've given them a 7 out of 10, though I feel like they do suffer from competition from the other multitudes units, which I would probably rate just that little bit stronger at the moment. Talking of which, we have the melee pattern Hormagaunts, 65 points for 10 of them or 130 for 20. Like the Termagants, a Battleline infantry unit, putting a whole load of bodies on the board and with good OC. The Hormagaunts don't have any range damage and instead swap that for some Strength 3 AP1 claws, going up to Strength 4 in Synapse, so quite a meaningful breakpoint if you can get that there. And compared with the Termagants, they do have the big advantage of having much faster movement. It means that you could have them hiding behind a ruin and then swarm onto the midboard objectives, almost certainly flipping it in your favour given how much OC that they have. With a fast movement and advance and charge, they should be able to get there, and if the opponent's got any fairly light infantry, they should be able to do at least some damage to them, and they also might enjoy some invasion fleet damage buffs for sustained hits or lethal hits depending on what you're fighting. Again, they could be a big unit in Unending Swarm if trying to make that work. They really quite like these surge moves there to propel them into melee. Again, for downsides, they don't really tend to be mainline damage dealers for the swarms. With low strength and damage attacks, they're not usually going to be threatening anything that's too tough in terms of saves or toughness. Small arms fire is going to clear them fairly quickly, and again, Unending Swarm isn't in the most favourable spot with the detachments right now. Even despite that though, they're a strong unit. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. Really quite nice for surging forward into the midboard, taking primaries off the opponent, and then when they hit back and lightly wipe out the squad, it's not really the end of the world as they're quite expendable. Finally, for the troops endless multitudes, we have the Gargoyles. They're 85 points for 10 of them or 170 per 20. Really quite a lot more expensive than the Hormagaunts and Termagants. They do have the big advantages that the Hormagaunts have, good OC with 2 apiece, and they also move fast, a good 12 inches with the fly keyword, so could do a similar sort of trick to the Hormagaunts swooping onto objectives, though they're not going to be doing quite so much damage in melee, just at range really with those flesh borers. Their Datasheet special rule is a particularly good one though. Move shoot move means that they can cross the board genuinely quite quickly. Effectively an 18-inch move if they can shoot a flesh borer at something, and they can also do that after deep striking as well, meaning that they're really quite a flexible unit for getting into areas of the board that deep strikers shouldn't usually be able to. Dropping at 9 inches, shooting something, and then moving 6 inches. It could get you in the right position to do some secondary objectives, or even tip a primary over to your side if the opponent's deployed slightly off it. as well as things like replenishing in Invasion Fleet once again. They quite like the Vanguard Onslaught given that they've got the relevant keyword for that. It gives them more options such as Advance and Charge if that makes sense, and Return to Reserve for a stratagem. And if you wanted an unusually slightly punchy Gargoyle squad, you could combo them with the Winged Prime if desired. For their downsides, they do cost more than the other multitudes, which is a downside if you're just using them as a sort of trading objectives piece. And compared with the other two, they're even squishier and easier to kill, given that they only get a 6+ armor save. Even compared with the other ones, they're notably bad in terms of damage per point, only getting the flesh borers. And while putting in it Winged Prime for skirmish purposes is interesting enough, it's probably not usually the best idea, given that it makes a utility unit just far less cheap and expendable. Overall, I've given them an 8 out of 10, the same as the Hormagaunts. Both quite good units to swarm and tie up the enemy and have some board control, and maybe tipping primers over to your side while they do so. Before we move on to the other Tyranid infantry, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in ObjectiveMarkers.com. They're a UK based maker of some faction themed objective markers that can work well for Warhammer 40k. The main offerings are these things, basically clear flexible silicon mats to act as objective markers, as the name might suggest. Really quite common accessories for Warhammer 40k. You basically have a 40mm central circle marked out on the disc, and then a 3-inch zone extending all around that, so you can basically tell at a glance whether or not a unit is on an objective or not, without having to measure to that central circle every time. They've got a whole number of different designs, and the idea is to add a bit of faction-specific theme, while also having them on a clear disc, so it doesn't detract too much from the gaming surface that you're playing on, so you can see the battlefield terrain through them. They do of course have an appropriate space swarm design that works well for the Tyranids, but lots of other ones on top of that, some ones for your Golden Guardians of Terror, your power armoured Marines, one for the Forces of Chaos, one for Greenskins, and one for some ancient robot skeletons. As part of their introductory offerings, they're shipping out a few free dice with each one of these that goes out at the moment, 10 of them in this gold and black design. And they do have a few other things on their web store as well, such as these clear ruined terrain bases for marking out the footprints of terrain. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description, and if you'd like to take a look over their stuff, it's usually £25 or $35 per set of 6 of these. They ship to the UK and USA at the moment. A big thank you to them for sponsoring a bigger project like this one. Next up, we have the final Endless Multitudes unit that isn't a battle line choice, and that's the Neurogaunts. They're 45 points for 11 models, or 90 points for 22, and they're basically just very cheap bodies that conduct synapse. They've got a similar sort of stat line to the Gargoyles, but they don't move fast, and if they're within synapse range, then the synapse gets conducted through them, so units that are within 6 inches of the swarm will also count as being there. I feel like in reality maybe their best value though is just being an OC11 unit for 45 points. They can have really quite a lot of board control. You could have a unit of them hanging around in the home field, and there'd be a target your opponent wouldn't really want to waste firepower on, but could deny a lot of deep strike, or have them push up towards a mid-board objective for a really nice expendable unit that still has plenty of objective taking capacity. And if they ever do any synapse conducting, then so much the better. They do have obvious downsides. They have almost no damage output at all. They don't have the other selling points like special rules or boosted speed of the other Endless Multitudes. They don't get OC2, and for the Tyranids in particular, there's really quite a lot of units for super cheap individual units, more so than other factions. Overall, between all that, they're a little bit rare to be used on the tabletop, just because there's so much competition for things that could do their role, though I must admit I do quite like cheap units that have a lot of wounds. They do add some nice advantages to playing the mission. Perhaps the biggest shame for them is they just are a bit of a questionable idea to go with a Neuro Tyrant, as seems like the plan for Games Workshop. If you join the Neuro Tyrant to the unit, then it might mean that he winds up taking a whole bunch of wounds that wounded the squad at their base toughness of 3, so it means that the Neuro Tyrant itself might wind up taking a chunk of damage from small arms. Overall, I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. Just for super cheap expendable chaff though, I might have been persuaded to push it up to a 7. From small swarms to smaller swarms, next up we have the Rippers. Smaller Tyranid feeder organisms, all very helpful in digesting a planet. In game they're 25 points for a single base, going up to 50 for a set of 3. Tiny units in Warhammer 40k always have value all of their own. Getting a 25 point single base that can deep strike is something that quite a few armies would have interest in. They can screen and do area denial things. You can do certain secondaries with them, such as engage on all fronts and behind enemy lines. They've got the potential to worsen objective control, and while their damage output is pretty low, for their points cost it's not nothing into lighter infantry, particularly in Invasion Fleet where bad hit rolls with mass attacks goes a little bit further with either sustained or lethal hits. They're going to be most stand out in the Assimilation Swarm though, given that it gives you a Harvester unit for a very cheap points investment that you can just basically have as a placeholder type squad, giving you something else to trigger out those healing bonuses. For their main downsides, they have no OC, so they can't do primaries and they can't do the action secondaries. The damage output isn't usually going to do very much, and they're at least fairly trivial to take down, though I wouldn't say their per point durability is really a weak point. They do have quite a lot of wounds to soak up fire at least. Perhaps their biggest disadvantage though is that Tyranids have lots of other small cheap units to compete with them, and in particular before you look at Ripper Swarms you should probably add a Biovore into the list, which can do a similar thing for spawning tiny OC0 units and getting much of the same utility but like 5 times over. Overall, as a result, Ripper Swarms don't tend to be unusable but are pretty niche. Maybe their role gets a little bit more redundant when you have Biovores around. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here, though I'd rate them far better than that in Assimilation Swarm. Next up, we've got the new 10th edition Gun Gaunts in the Barb Gaunts, first coming out in Leviathan. These guys shower enemy infantry with explosive shrapnel from their barb launchers. They're 55 points for a squad of 5 of them, 110 points for a squad of 10. They've got 2 wounds with 4+ save and toughness 4 each, and then a barb launcher for d6 shots apiece, hitting at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1 with blast. A profile that's not really going to worry any tough stuff out there, but against 1 wound infantry it's pretty deadly. It's really quite a lot of volume fire, and then multiple copies of blast means that if you're firing at say a 10-man squad, the shots are going to stack up very quickly, never mind if it's more. Their datasheet rule is genuinely a handy debuff to have once in the army as well. After you've shot in your shooting phase, one enemy infantry unit hit by the unit is -2 to its move and -2 to advance and charge. And while that won't be useful against every enemy army out there, against certain factions with slow, heavy-hitting melee troops, it'll be pretty big. For the downsides though, they don't really have a very general-purpose damage threat. The debuff not working against non-infantry means there will be lots of lists where they just don't really care about that ability. And even in lists that you do, you might not always have line of sight to the thing that you want to. And while for 11 points per model I'd say their durability is alright, certain damage profiles like heavy bolters will be very effective against them and pick up the squad incredibly easily. Overall, I've given them a 6 out of 10, solidly usable but not super standout, and you don't see them too often in competitive lists. Next up, we've got some Tyranid Vanguard in the Gene Stealers, 75 points for 5 or 150 per 10. These precursors of the Tyranid invasion move forward fast, a big 8-inch scout move, and then an 8-inch move after that. Pretty easily able to jump into the midboard and maul enemy infiltrators, or even charge one deployment zone to the other on certain maps. When they get there, they'll do well against enemy infantry, mass accurate strength 4, AP 2 and damage 1 attacks. Against anything space marine size or weaker, they'll blend hordes pretty well. And then they've got a good leader choice in the Broodlord. It's very viable to take a big 150 point squad of them and add in a Broodlord for a bit more melee muscle, and he gives them devastating wounds and the synapse keyword, so they're going to be hitting with those attacks at strength 5. The durability isn't huge, but it's not nothing. To be honest, compared with Gene Stealer stat lines in the past, the 10th edition one isn't terrible for taking at least a little damage before going down, and they particularly stand out in certain detachments. One of the more threatening units with the Vanguard Invader keyword that you can get in Vanguard Onslaught, and I'll certainly enjoy the advance and charge as well. They're really quite efficient for stratagems there. They can do well in invasion fleets too. Well, quite enjoy the damage bonuses that can bring, and maybe a feel no pain for a bit of durability in return. For weaknesses, again, certain profiles like heavy bolters will be really quite effective against them, and everything else at least okay. Even with the Broodlord, they might struggle against properly tough multi-wound threats. They're not going to be bringing down monsters and battle tanks with ease, and particularly not tough ones. And they might just have a little bit less draw in the subterranean assault detachment potentially. Other melee things that are usually harder to deliver to melee may be getting a bit more of a jump on them if there is easy access to close combat with tunnels. They are still usable there though. Overall though, wherever they're fielded, I'll still rate them as a very strong unit. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10. Both usable for a small interference rush unit, and also a bigger melee threat with a Broodlord. Next up, we've got the Tyranid Commanding Elite with the Warriors, a Synapse unit of 3 or 6 models. The melee versions are 75 points for 3 or 150 for 6, and that gets you 3 models with Synapse and Toughness 5, a 4+ save and 3 wounds. The melee Warriors get some mass twin-linked attacks with Strength 6 and AP -2, given they'll always be in Synapse range, and they also have twin-linked. They might only be damage 1, but that's a profile that will absolutely annihilate most infantry units out there, particularly if you've got a 6-man squad. It's going to be solidly threatening to any tanks and vehicles that aren't toughness 12 as well. They've got good synergy with the Winged Prime. He can maybe range out the front of the squad a little bit and reduce their charge threat range due to his bigger movement profile. He gives them a damage buff and the Vanguard Invader keyword as well. Providing Synapse is pretty handy if you have other units advancing alongside that will enjoy it, and their special rule can tilt to a little bit of extra damage or a bit of extra defense, which is quite nice to have the flexibility. They could get some short charges with the Subterranean Assault, could be a threatening Vanguard Invader unit if you add the Winged Prime in, and they're a focal unit of the Warrior Bioform detachment if you want to use that one, with lots of the synergies revolving around them. In 10th edition, Warriors have struggled to be a mainline frontline unit though. Their defensive profile isn't standout awful, but again is one where just about any unit in the game is going to have good damage against them, whether it's small arms or dedicated anti-tank. They're also not particularly fast, which can mean that getting them into melee is the biggest problem for them, either needing to be a bit more of a countercharge style unit and make clever use of terrain, or do something else intelligent. And maybe not too helpful for them that the warrior bioform detachment isn't that strong, if that was going to be the place where they had the most focus. Overall, I've given them a 7 out of 10. Some people do really like them. I could have been persuaded to rank them a bit lower than that though. Otherwise, there's their ranged counterparts. They trade out their twin-linked 1 attack and some AP on their melee profile for a bit of range threat. They can have a Barb Strangler and Venom Cannon per 3 models. They're cheaper at 65 points per set of 3 of them, and overall they've got a profile that can bully lighter enemy units at least fairly well. Maybe having a pretty good chance of winning a one-on-one fight with plenty of their contemporaries out there in 40k. They do have a bit of OC, they are cheap units to provide synapse, and they can't be locked in melee as well as they can fall back, shoot and charge. In warrior bioform they have a couple of stratagems that can help them out with their range profiles. In general though, they haven't really been very popular this edition despite quite a cheap price tag. Again, the defensive profile isn't awful for wounds for the cost, though most guns will be effective against them. The damage profile is a bit scattergun and not very strong against tough targets, and there are other cheap units that can provide synapse as well, such as a Lictor with lone operative protection, or Wings Prime or melee warriors. Overall, and again with so much competition for small unit Tyranid utility, they very rarely seem to make the cut. I've given them a 5.5 out of 10. I still say in reality though, they're not the biggest investment in an army list, and between synapse and some ability to bully other infantry fairly well, they're not unworkable. Next up we have the Spore Cloud generating Venom Throbes, hovering towards the enemy with their disturbing barbed tentacles. They're 70 points for a squad of 3 of them, and 140 for a squad of 6, and they shield your units against shooting, an aura of cover against things, and an aura of stealth for non-monsters, so having a bit more value for buffing durable infantry if anything. They've got inbuilt stealth themselves, and sort of warrior style profiles for some okayish durability at range between those two. When they get into close combat, they can do alright against lighter infantry, wounding them on a 2+ with a bunch of AP0 attacks. In general, these guys really aren't awful to have for a single unit in the heart of a Tyranid army, and maybe particularly on more casual tables where there might not be quite so heavy amounts of line of sight blocking. For more optimised armies though, they rarely seem to make the cut. Cover's not really the hardest thing to come by in 40k 10th edition, there tends to be lots of it about. The monster data sheets are maybe the ones you most want to protect, and they're the ones that don't get the stealth. So despite having some good use for units nearby and their own profiles for some nuisance utility after that, they often get passed over. Otherwise for weaknesses they do have kind of diminishing returns, so it's probably 1 squad in an army list at max, and they are kind of matchup specific, basically only really doing anti-shooting and their defensive buffs not helping against melee. Despite that though, I'd still say they're usable. If you've got a list with a bunch of durable infantry units, maybe things like some swarm style Tyranids going on, then a unit hiding out of line of sight could be handy. I've given them a 6 out of 10 overall. Next up for their dual build psychic option, we've got the sinister hovering zone throbes, 100 points for 3 and 200 for 6, born aloft on their psychic energies and blasting the enemy with some warp lances. Their shooting's fairly scary in general purpose, they can hit the enemy fairly hard at 24 inches, either las cannon style shots with the warp lances or some blast profiles that are quite good against heavier infantry. It's quite common to see them fielded alongside a Neuro Tyrant which can lead them, and that's got the bonus of giving them a +1 to hit, and also with a weird rules interaction gives them the big guns never tire rule, so they can basically fire in combat. That turns off a major weakness for them, which is being locked in combat. They might quite enjoy the Synaptic Nexus in particular, given they're a big scary focal synapse damage dealer. In particular, you can use the reroll stratagem for them to reroll 1s to hit and wounds, and they could be interesting in Subterranean Assault for delivering firepower accurately. Beyond that, they have a few more advantages, providing a weak and vulnerable save to Tyranids nearby. Occasionally that might do something, and while their durability isn't standout, their high and vulnerable saves can occasionally spike pretty well. It'll just depend on your ability to roll some 4+, and if the stars align they might occasionally heal something from battle shock if the enemy gets close. For downsides, despite having some good and vulnerable saves, their defense isn't really very standout against all that many attacks. They're still hurt pretty well by small arms and damage 3. They're pretty slow moving and their range isn't crazily enormous. And if you don't have a Neuro Tyrant leading the unit, then being tagged in melee is going to be a bad thing as they won't be able to shoot. Maybe their biggest issue is competition with things like the Exocrine Tyrannocyte or Maliceptor, big dangerous Tyranid beasties with heavy firepower that are also a fair bit more durable than these zone throbes. Despite some downsides though, they're still a solid psychic firepower unit, could be delivered well in 2 lines of sight with the Subterranean Assault, and I've given them an 8 out of 10 for in-game power overall. Next up, we've got some burrowing Tyranids from below in the Raveners. With their recent kill team kit, they've gone up to 5 models with 125 points. bursting from the ground to shred infantry behind their fortified positions. Their damage output is at least fairly punchy, lots of strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2 attacks with twin links, and that makes them pretty solid against marine equivalents, and fairly nice against anything that's toughness 9 or less. When they're on the board, they move pretty quickly with a 10-inch move, and they've got the return to reserve special rule, which means they can pop up at different locations around the map, maybe nice enough for a bit of secondary utility or threatening things that otherwise wouldn't be under threat, and particularly great in subterranean assault, which is one of the stronger detachments right now, as that means they can basically turn on turn spawn tunnel markers. If you want to make them into a true mainline damage threat, you can join them with a unit of hyper-adaptive Raveners. That'll add sustained hits, better damage profiles, the Synapse keyword for strength 6, and some free rapid ingress. Between all that, you have a unit that's going to inflict some pretty monstrous damage to most things in the game. And with the Vanguard Invader keyword, they can also be an interesting unit in Vanguard Onslaught with access to all the stratagems and advance and charge. For downside, their return to reserves for utility and secondaries was a bit more useful when they were a cheaper unit. 125 points is quite a lot for something that's mainly going to be focusing on scoring some small points. Again, their Tyranid warrior profile is a little mid to weak on the durability front. Not awful, but just about anything can take chunks out of it, and they maybe feel a little bit more detachment specific than certain Tyranid units out there, just getting lots more out of the Vanguard and the Subterranean. Given they're a powerful unit in one of the strongest detachments though, I've given them an 8 out of 10. Definitely an interesting unit between their movement tricks, speed, and their damage output can certainly blend certain targets well. Next up, we've got some heavier armoured Tyranids with the Tyrant Guard. These guys are basically walking shields for the Hive Tyrants, 80 points for a squad of 3 of them and 160 for a squad of 6. The biggest asset and draw is their defense for the cost. 4 wounds at toughness 8 with a 3+ save is really quite solid for 26 points. It's going to take some effort to chew through these guys, and the idea is generally that they attach to Hive Tyrants or the Swarm Lords to allow them to play more aggressively. They could attach to Neuro Tyrants too. It feels like they're interesting enough for both of those. They're both high investment units that do have some alright damage, but don't have the biggest defensive profiles in the world, so including them could add a bit more freedom as to where they go on the board, as opposed to having to worry about hiding behind terrain quite so much. They could be an interesting unit to resurrect with entire models coming back in Assimilation Swarm, or a really big Synapse unit for Synaptic Nexus, or just be a really chunky add-on to keep the Swarm Lord alive and kicking at the forefront of the army, putting his command point debuff on things in the mid-board. For their downsides, their personal damage output is really quite low. It will add a bit of backup fights to the Tyrants, but not so much. Their movement is a bit awkwardly slower than the Tyrants, so potentially they could wind up slowing them down a little bit. Though I guess they do have a better interaction with terrain due to the Infantry keyword, which helps. The special rule is a touch on the niche side. The Tyrants not really normally needing the feel no pain against precision, as they're not really at risk of being sniped out. And I feel like for most people at the moment, they generally tend to prefer the use of just good terrain to protect their valuable Tyrants. And you could argue that buying 80 points worth of basically defensive upgrade for a Hive Tyrant or Swarm Lord make them far less efficient for the role that you want them to fulfill in your army. As a result, they still tend to be really quite a niche pick, though again I'd argue certainly not unusable. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here. Next up for their dual build kit in the Combat Patrol, we've got the Hive Guard, hulking Tyranid constructs with some heavy firepower. They're 90 points per squad of 3 or 180 per squad of 6, and they're also notably tough for the cost. 4 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save here is not bad for 30 points, and they have been making a bit of a comeback in the meta recently, with some anti-vehicle 2+ firepower with their shot cannons being all rather useful to have around when Imperial Knights wind up being strong. Most people take the shot cannons over the Impalers, 2 shots at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 3, and anti-vehicle 2+, so a full unit is going to stack a bunch of saves, and for everyone that's failed it will be felt quite hard. Their special rule gives you some boosted Overwatch, hitting on a 4+, while the unit's within range of an objective marker, so a pretty reasonable investment for the command points to basically get an extra phase of shooting out of them. In particular, they've also been enjoying the subterranean assault detachments to get some lines of sight, the tunnel markers helping out with their weakness of slow movement and shortish range. Plus they've got quite a nice shooting stratagem there, allowing them to get sustained hits one and ignore cover, which are both really big on that AP-1 shot cannon profile. For their downsides though, they're definitely a unit with lots of weaknesses. In places where they can't get ignored cover, AP-1 really hurts the anti-vehicle shooting. If they get cover, then they're going to be saving those punchy attacks on a 3+ or better usually. They don't have super long range. If they're tagged in melee, then they can't shoot. The damage output isn't particularly exciting against anything but their intended target of vehicles. Their OC isn't particularly high, and they've got the weakness of being tagged in melee turning off their shooting in plenty of detachments. I think for most armies, more general purpose shooting threats like Exocrines, Tyrannocytes or Maliceptors or Zoanthropes are probably going to be better. Subterranean Assault definitely helps to undo a bunch of their weaknesses, though I feel like they might not be quite as relevant to the meta now that Knights have got nerfed. If we wind up seeing a fair few fewer Knights players out there, then really dedicated anti-vehicle firepower probably won't have quite so much excess value. Overall, despite weaknesses, they do have some interest still. I've given them a 6 out of 10, I would rank them better in the Subterranean Assault with the access to that nice shooting stratagem, and if you happen to know that you're going into a really vehicle-heavy meta, then that's also going to be a positive. Before we move on to some all rather stealthy infantry, I'll just quickly mention one way to support Auspex tactics through any model purchases that you might be making in the near future. If you did happen to be ordering in some reinforcements for the Swarm online, the channel's got a bunch of discount retailers, links down in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Feminist Workshop in Canada for 10%, Wargame Portal for 15% off in the USA, and Tash and Geldeep in Germany and the EU for around 16 to 20. If you did happen to be ordering in some model soldiers or hobby supplies, all of those stores help to support Auspex tactics through any purchases made through the links below. So a big thank you to anyone using those if and when you pick something up. Next up, we're into some stealthy Tyranid forward operatives. I thought we'd talk through the Von Ryan's Leapers and then the various Lictors and lone operative variants all together. The Von Ryan's Leapers were an interesting addition in Leviathan, basically mini Lictors that hunt in packs. In game they're 70 points for 3 of them and 140 for 6. That gives you a fairly cheap, fairly fast moving infiltrate unit. They've got mass damage 1 attacks, and fights first could put off some lighter infantry units from charging them. They could take a chunk out of them first. They do have a few helpful keywords and abilities. Stealth and a 6+ invulnerable save makes them just a little bit tougher to kill compared with warrior stat lines. They get a free heroic intervention as well, which I'd say maybe is a bit more on the niche side if they're going to be operating far from the rest of the and use as skirmish infiltrators. But if it ever does come up, then it works quite well with fights first, and they do have some alright support in Vanguard Onslaught, having the relevant keywords. Overall, between all that, I feel like they're usable enough, and I feel like you see quite a lot of them on the table as they come in the starter sets in 10th edition. Lots of people tend to have them in good numbers. As with a few Tyranids units out there, I'd say probably their biggest issues on the tabletop are competition with other solid utility units, in particular the standard Lictor. That's the cheapest infiltrator at 60 points, which can still zone out an area of the board and a pretty excellent value. And if you wanted a bigger, chunkier damage dealer Vanguard style unit, you might be more tempted by things like the Gene Stealers or the hyper adaptive Raveners. The strength 5 and damage 1 melee makes them a bit more limited as well. They'll only threaten certain units, and given that they just won't do too much damage to tougher stuff, the fights first isn't as big of a charge deterrent as it might be on other squads. The heroic intervention is a bit of a niche one and might not necessarily trigger too often, and the leadership 8 could be a genuine issue for them occasionally outside of synapse range. Overall, between all that, they're still an interesting unit though. Cheap skirmishing infiltrator units are rarely a bad thing to have. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. I feel like they're not really all that far behind the Lictor, though I would rate that as stronger. Speaking of which, let's talk through the Tyranids lone operatives. The Lictor is a standard infantry one without character, bursting from the shadows with its chameleonic form to claw apart the enemy. These guys are just 60 points, which is already a great start for a lone operative, never mind all the rest of its fairly powerful abilities. Lone operatives are nice to have in Warhammer 40k. They can screen out areas of the board due to you not being able to interact with them, and they can safely do some secondary objectives or even contest primaries if the opponent's nowhere near. Lictors have got lots of advantages beyond that though. They're pretty fast, which is another thing that you'd want lone operatives to be. Their durability is genuinely alright for a 60 point lone operative. Toughness 6, 6 wounds and stealth is really quite good between all that. Their damage profile is solidly punchy, a bunch of attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, hitting on a 2+ with precision and fights first, compared with the Leapers maybe a little bit more likely to do a bit of meaningful damage to some heavier infantry if they get charged and drag something down in return. As mentioned, they're a cheap infiltrate unit, so really nice for on-the-board screening and board control. It's another very valuable use for them. They might occasionally even gain a command point if they manage to slay a character unit, and they've got some great support from Vanguard Onslaught, allowing them to do tricks like turning off shooting at a very tiny range, and returning to reserves can be a big one for them. Finally, as if that wasn't enough utility options, they also have the choice to do a free rapid ingress, so that means they could jump onto the board at the flanks, arrive just outside of 12 inches of an enemy unit, to basically guarantee that they can't be attacked, but are going to guarantee that they get a charge on something first in the next turn. So if you want it, you can basically guarantee a first strike on an outlying enemy unit. Overall, all around it's a huge amount of options, and the Lictor can do several battlefield roles really quite well, infiltrating, rapid ingress, or maybe slightly backfield lone operativing. It feels like the biggest downsides are that you can't necessarily do that all at once, so you're going to have some decisions to make as to how you use your Lictors each game. and there is some competition with the other Tyranid lone operatives, 2 of which I'd rate as very good indeed as well. In any case, absolutely stand out for value. I've given them a 9.5 out of 10. Talking through the other lone operatives though, next up we have the Neuro Lictor, 80 points, so a slightly more expensive lone operative, though still has lots of the utility factor that the Lictor does. All the difference is, it's tougher to take down on an individual model base. It has a 4+ invulnerable save and 7 wounds, so a bit more chance for other units to bounce off it. And beyond that, it trades some utility, such that its damage threat with damage 2, and the free rapid ingress for some battle shock shenanigans. It's got 2 rules to make battle shock far more meaningful. You can make battle shock tests happen in your command phase to stop enemies contesting your primary objectives. As a result, it can be handy to have one of these sort of lurking kind of nearby a mid-board objective, maybe out of line of sight behind terrain, and then otherwise battle shocked units nearby are debuffed for a -1 to hit from them and a +1 to wound from you. That's a big deal for making battle shock so much more useful, including its own debuff special rule, and can be a genuinely massive damage increase to a fighty enemy unit that was pushing up the midfield. On top of that, it also provides synapse as well, which is definitely useful to have on a lone operative. For downsides, it doesn't have anywhere near as much damage threat as the regular Lictor. Only damage 1 attacks are a big weakness. You don't have the fights first or the free rapid ingress. It is 20 points pricier than the regular Lictor, and while the battle shock debuff is genuinely a very good one, it's never going to be super reliable. There's a good time when you most need this to function, the enemy's just going to pass the test. Nevertheless though, between all that, they're a very interesting unit. Definitely a solid alternative to the Lictor, and a good way to get more value out of Shadow in the Warp. I've given them an 8 out of 10. Next up, we've got the spooky scary Death Leaper. He is also 80 points as a lone operative and has more similarities to the regular Lictor, just with a few tweaks and changes. It's basically got the regular fighty attacks of the standard Lictor, but comes with far more durability with them, having 7 wounds, a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, so a little bit more likely to survive on the front lines. Otherwise, the biggest deal that he has is trading out the free rapid ingress for an aura of -1 leadership and forcing battle shock tests for damaged units within range of his ability. So again, he's going to be a nice one to have skulky on a mid-board objective and could potentially really interfere with enemy primary scoring. I basically see him as an alternative to the Lictor, but really quite a usable one. Probably the biggest downside is the extra 20 points and maybe more having a side grade for the utility rather than a direct upgrade. He just seems like the choice that if you're planning on using a Lictor for some lone operative infiltrating, so starting in the mid-board, then he's got some good arguments to be a better fit for that. A tougher unit with a genuinely useful leadership debuff on a mid-board objective. Overall, again, I rate him as really quite solid. I've given him an 8 out of 10. Finally, for the Tyranid lone operatives, we've got the Parasite of Mortrex. This guy's the winged disturbing Tyranid parasites that can inject you with eggs and have rippers burst out of you, and costs 80 points, so the same amount as the Neurolictor and Death Leaper. For advantages, compared with the other lone operatives, he moves fast with 12 inches and fly, so it's quicker than the rest. You can deep strike him if you want to. He maybe could be alright for doing secondary objectives with that small base. He has the Synapse keyword, so you can get that in position to buff units nearby on a platform that's going to be hard to kill as he's a lone operative. Has a little bit of anti-infantry damage, and if he does manage to get the jump on an ideal target and kill something with that ovipositor, then he gets 2 spawn D3 nuisance ripper swarms. That's really quite a genuinely good ability if he can manage to trigger it. Despite sort of having a name, he's also a generic character technically, so he can bear enhancements on a safe and mobile unit if he just wants to have something on the board and kept safe. For his downsides, I will just say for what he offers, he is just outclassed by the 3 other Lictor subtypes, all of which are really quite good. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with his rules, but he probably should be priced more similar to the regular Lictor than the Neurolictor and Death Leaper, I suspect. His damage output is just kind of low and light infantry focused, and the Ripper swarming maneuver isn't even guaranteed to go off. Even if he gets into an absolutely ideal target, he could just roll badly. He's easier to kill than the other Lictor variants and has no invulnerable save. He can't infiltrate like the rest of them, which is another fair enough draw to them. And his other special rule of Battle Shock at the start of the fight phase is kind of niche as it goes for helping out Tyranids. Overall, he's not unusable. Lone operatives still have good value, and he's a fast moving one with some other fun stuff, but I've given him a 6 out of 10 overall. He just feels solidly behind the rest of the lone operatives. Next up, we've got the faithful Tyranid artillery beastie that is the Biovore. It's model redesigned in plastic for 10th edition. You can field units of 1 to 3 Biovores, they generally just tend to get fielded as an individual one for 50 points, and their role is to camp in the backfield of a Tyranid army, spawning out spore mines each turn. Its rule allows one unit of these to put a spore mine anywhere within range that's greater than 9 inches away from enemy units, so you basically spawn in 3 deep striking units at OC0. Overall, it works out being pretty excellent value given that 50 points gives you essentially 6 utility units, including the Biovore itself. Those spawn spore mines could be used to deny some deep strike or reserves and plug gaps where it might make sense. You could put them down on choke points or mid-board objectives, as the spore mines deny advance moves within 6 inches of them. That means that if the opponent needs to advance to take a mid-board objective, suddenly they can't. They might also be able to physically block some movement against some faster moving vehicles and monsters too. They could basically auto-complete certain secondary objectives, such as engaging all fronts behind enemy lines or others, and if they have any extra value, such as dividing firepower from important units elsewhere, or even dealing the odd mortal wound or two, that's just added value. Meanwhile, the Biovore can sit camped on a home field objective or screening some other part of your deployment zone. If it made sense to, or if it's in a position to, it might be able to do some actions for some secondary objectives or challenger cards. And in a pinch, it might occasionally make sense to try and make use of its indirect fire instead. Generally, if you just need one wound through on one unit to either outright kill it and hopefully stop the opponent getting some victory points, then occasionally it could be worth it as a low chance of something great. Overall though, in terms of utility unit support, just about every faction in Warhammer 40k would take a unit like this if they had it. I guess for weaknesses, the range damage isn't really all that good. They're not really balanced around actually dealing damage with their indirect fire, and no more than one unit of these can spawn spore mines, so as a result you'd usually just have one of them taken. Either way though, neither of those detracts from a 50.1 of these being pretty amazing and pretty well auto-include for competitive Tyranid lists right now. I've given it the full 10 out of 10 here. For its flame-spurting cousin, the Pyrovore, again they can be in squads of 1 to 3, 40 points for 1, 70 for 2, or 105 points for 3 of them, giving you a small gun bug with at least an okay defensive stat line. Again, they're yet another competitor for cheap Tyranid units for chaff and nuisance purposes. Just 40 points for a single model is nice for that, and they can take up one area of the board. Their Flame Spurt can take a chunk out of lighter infantry, and could at least be an option for Overwatch if there's something super light advancing, though if you've only got one it's probably going to be kind of low yield. Maybe if 1 or 2 casualties are pretty critical somehow. As nuisance units to have running around, they could support a Tyranid firebase at least fairly well. They can strip cover from a unit, which is pretty good before you light them up with a whole bunch of exocrines or something. And they've got standout value in the assimilation swarm once again. They have the harvester keyword, so there can be cheap models that can give that to other units nearby. For its downsides, it's got a pretty short range, which means it might not be able to deal its own damage properly, or debuff the targets that you really want that ignore cover on. Like the Biovore, this one's got a pretty big and enormous 80mm base, which is pretty clunky for trying to hide them behind ruins and just move them around in general. They feel like one of the models that just doesn't really have a whole load of outright value for the sheer space it takes up on the board, and they have had a points rise or two for the smaller model units, which maybe makes them a little bit less powerful. Still not unusable though, they definitely have some good utility value. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 and I rate them better in Assimilation Swarm. Again though, as we've talked about, just a massive amount of small Tyranid utility units that they're competing against. Next up, we've got the Hungry Psychophage, a great devouring Tyranid tick bug style thing, which has got some preference for chowing down on the warp sensitive psychers of the various races out there in the galaxy. And quite a fun model that's been really quite easy to acquire in 10th edition. I'd imagine plenty of Tyranids players have a good number of these between Leviathan and the starter sets. The Psychophage recently got a pretty big rules rewrite. It went up to 110 points, that became quite a lot more threatening. Games Workshop shaking things up a bit from the previous Feel No Pain aura that it gave. The Psychophage still remains pretty tanky for the cost. 10 wounds with a 5+ Feel No Pain means that you usually need to take down 15 wounds worth of monster to bring it down. It does have the smoke keyword as well, which could make it yet harder to kill. Its changed up special rule is pretty interesting as well. It now debuffs one enemy unit that gets hit by its shooting attack, and then Tyranids get more AP against that unit in melee. It's pretty nice for several units. It can help out with its own melee going up to AP3, though anything with AP2 and a fair bit of melee damage will enjoy that. Maybe the Auspex being an obvious one in subterranean assaults, but everything else from things like melee warriors to gene stealers or AP2 Ravener Talons might enjoy that. For its own damage threat, it's not quite as weedy as it used to be. It now has some okay damage to bully medium infantry and space marine equivalents. It has devastating wounds and some damage buffs against damaged units, and the anti-psychic keyword means that it can put out a fair amount of devastating wounds against those. It now also has pretty fast movement for a monster when previously it was kind of slow. It now moves a big 12 inches, so perhaps a better chance to get the jump on the enemy units rather than the other way around. It can be quite nice in subterranean assault when you can deliver things to melee quite easily, and maybe be in a position to set up its buff nicely as well, and again has some more value in the assimilation swarm with the harvester keyword. For downsides, it did go up in points. The damage isn't very general purpose, it's not going to do too much against monsters and vehicles, and outside of super easy subterranean assault delivery, the damage debuff could be a little bit clunky to bring to bear on the exact right target at the right time. It's only got a 12-inch range, and you are kind of weighing up the points being put into another outright damage dealer that can also hit hard. I feel like it maybe has some slight diminishing returns after one copy of its special rule, and some armies might have preferred the previous version with the Feel No Pain that was enjoyed well enough by monsters. Overall, I'd say he's solidly usable though. I've given him a 7 out of 10. Quite nice in support of certain melee combos, and particularly in subterranean assault. Next up, we've got maybe the most standard and storied Tyranid monstrous creature in the card effects. 115 points for one of these living battering rams, 230 for 2. You can fill 2 in the same squad. And then they've got a punchy monster profile that can be joined by Old One Eye for some scary damage buffs. For the datasheet themselves, they are very flexible. You could spec them to various different combos of range and melee if you'd like to. They can put out some fairly good volume fire. Their surge move mechanic can make them fairly problematic to shoot. If they're nearby weaker units, they might just walk straight into combat and start slicing things up. And they could be nice enough in Crusher Stampedes or getting closer range charges with subterranean assault. For weaknesses, perhaps their biggest issue is that their damage profile really feels like it's weighted around Old One Eye. Without the alpha regenerating card effects in the same unit, they're just kind of lackluster for how hard they can hit. Only hitting on a 4+ is a bit of a downside. Even with him, they're also quite a niche choice, having to compete against multiple other monsters that might just be the better choice on the front line. Maybe the Norn Emissary and the Maliceptor being some good frontline choices, but also other good stuff like Haraspexes or maybe Trigons in Subterranean. Overall, I've given them a 5 out of 10. Feels like they just cost a bit much for what they really do at the moment, which is a shame for one of the most iconic Tyranid monstrous creatures. Next up, we've got the new Carnifex variant from Leviathan called the Screamer Killer, a throwback to the Bioplasma 4-talent monstrosity from days past. He's 135 points, 2 field in game, and has a much more dangerous damage profile than the regular Carnifexes. He gets a whole bunch of attacks at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3. Like the regular Carnifexes, he also has a 2+ save, which can work rather well with cover. In particular, his model is fairly easy to hold an outstretched claw behind cover of some point. In theory, it's very easy to get a cover save on indeed. And beyond that, he's got a bit of extra value from his bioplasmic scream that can chew through some infantry and hand out battle shock tests out of sequence, which could be more relevant for the Tyranids than most, given that you might have newer Lictors about to capitalise on that for some extra damage. You'll quite enjoy the monstrous synergies of Crusher Stampede, or could get some close charges popping up from a tunnel in subterranean assault. For downsides, its speed of 8 inches is a little bit on the slow side when needing to get around terrain, and the vast majority of his damage being locked to melee. Toughness 11 and Toughness 12 profiles will care about his profile far less than certain Tyranid rivals. His soul is enough into things that are Toughness 10 or lower though. Again, like the Carnifexes, I feel like his points just aren't really quite where they need to be versus the competition though. In particular, the other melee damage dealers such as the Haraspexes, the Norns, and all the ranged or hybrid big monstrous creatures. Overall, I don't feel like he's anywhere near as far away from usability as the regular Carnifexes, though still a bit behind the curve compared with the rest. I've given him a 6.5 out of 10. Talking melee murder monsters though, we've got the Hungry Haraspexes, an almost great big devouring Tyranid monstrosity, all ready to chew through the enemy infantry en masse. It's 125 points to field 1 in game, so a fairly cheap monstrous creature, and his melee profile is just really quite a big and general purpose one. Loads and loads of strength 7 damage 2 attacks, plus some big anti-tank fists hitting with a strength 14. As mentioned previously, he'll quite enjoy being delivered to melee with the subterranean assault, which does feel like he's got some fairly standout value for him, and he gets on very well with the Psychophage AP debuff, just because he's got quite so many attacks at strength 7 AP 1, making those AP 2 is just so much more threatening against the vast majority of targets in 40k. Otherwise, his defensive stats are pretty good. 14 wounds at toughness 11 is very adequate for 125 points. He's got a sniping tongue attack that might occasionally be able to have a shot at a leader and can make some battle shock tests happen, though they are kind of sideshows against his main melee profile. As well as subterranean assault jumping into close combat is also nice for the assimilation swarm, and does well in Crusher Stampede as well, being a melee monster that uses the detachment buffs rather well there. For downsides, unless he is supported by a Psychophage, the low AP of his damage could hurt a bit. It feels like a fair few tougher targets in 40k might have the chance of bouncing off a bit, or doing a whole chunk of damage but not wiping out the whole unit. The 8-inch movement again isn't particularly great for getting him there as well, unless he's got some sort of special way of getting into melee, maybe smashing through walls in Crusher Stampede or tunnels. There's at least a pretty reasonable chance he's going to be taking some heavy firepower before he makes it into melee, and having to charge the thing at the front of the enemy army probably isn't going to give him loads of choice as to what he deals damage to. Overall, definitely an interesting and scary datasheet though, and maybe doing a better job being a distraction Carnifex than the regular Carnifexes these days. A big scary monster that needs to be dealt with, otherwise it is going to cause some big damage, maybe soaking fire and drawing attention from the rest of the army. Next up, we've got the many-tentacled Toxicrin. This one's almost a bit like a big Venomthrope, lots of anti-infantry tentacles that wound infantry on a 2+, with tons of strength 6 and AP 1 damage 2 attacks, both at range and melee. He spits out some mortal wounds after moving around the board, and has a chance to lock enemies in melee with it, which occasionally could be quite disruptive. Compared with most monsters though, this guy has some pretty big weaknesses. His defense for the cost just isn't really very good. 150 points for the profile is more points than the most of these cost, and with short range is going to need to be closer and right at the forefront of the army, taking a bunch of damage. His damage profile is just very niche and very specific to infantry. In the right matchup it could genuinely be really quite intimidating, though in the wrong matchup he's going to be very weak indeed, which is a bit disappointing for a big 150 point monster. Like the other monsters, his 8-inch movement isn't exactly a big asset, and overall between all that he just compares pretty badly to pretty much any of the other damage dealer monsters you might want to take. The big tentacle profile is also kind of awkward to move around on a model point of view, and hard to hide out of line of sight as well. Between that I've scored him a 3 out of 10, quite clearly a datasheet that needs to be really quite a lot cheaper points wise. Next up, we've got the Maliceptor, a Tyranid hive node synaptic monstrous creature, harnessing its psychic might for some damage and defense. It's 170 points to field 1 in game, and compared with some of the other monsters, it's at least fairly tough. The psychic shield gives it a 4+ invulnerable save, and it's got quite a nice debuff against enemy units nearby. They'll be -1 to hit when they're close to it, which is generally going to have some good use when he's in melee. You might also debuff the wound roll too if they're battle shocks. Then its damage output is fairly nice in general purpose. A bunch of strength 10 and damage 3 attacks are hard to go too far wrong with. It could combo okay with the Hive Tyrant for lethal hits and Onslaught to advance. And compared with some of the other Tyranid gunbugs like the Exocrine and the Tyrannocyte, it does actually have a little bit of credible melee threat as well. Enough to help it bully small units, or at least chip some damage back if it is charged by something. It's quite handy to have a Synapse bug advancing it in the forward ranks as well that's pretty durable. It could be one option for that, maybe weighed up against the Norns. Maybe for the biggest downsides, the psychic damage is pretty close range and has the blast keyword, so you wouldn't be able to fire directly into your own melee. The damage is pretty easy to use, but maybe not super high for the 170 points, and as a result between those two, it maybe tends to be used in slightly lower numbers, alongside more Exocrines and Tyrannocytes for the damage dealers. Still though, it's a pretty solid and effective monstrous creature, pretty relevant in a bunch of different Tyranid detachments and hard to go wrong with. I've given it a score of 8.5 out of 10. Next up, we've got another very scary firepower dino bug with the mighty Exocrine, 140 points worth of living cannon monstrous creature. The Exocrine strikes with a punchy bioplasma attack that's really quite anti-heavy infantry in terms of damage profile, a bunch of strength 9, AP -3 and damage 3 shots at a fairly solid range, and the blast and heavy keywords for 2 different ways to increase that damage if you're either stationary or fighting against bigger units. It's particularly strong against medium and heavier infantry, and tougher monsters and vehicles are still going to need to fear saves from it. It can be made to punch up more with lethal hits, either from invasion fleets or a Hive Tyrant nearby. After it's fired, if it gets a hit on its targets, then you get 2 reroll hit rolls of 1 against that one, so you might be able to light up a target that isn't killed outright for further fire from other Exocrines or Tyrannocytes perhaps. And for 140 points I feel like its defense is adequate for its role, particularly given that it's not usually going to be the first thing on the front line. Overall, it's a solid Tyranid firepower platform, often getting play in a wide range of detachments, just due to it having good value on its datasheet alone. The main weaknesses are that it's not so hot against toughness 10 or more, particularly if you don't have lethal hits, and getting tagged in close combat isn't going to be ideal as well, given that it's got the blast keyword and can't fire into its own melee. Even with those downsides though, it's still great at what it does. I've given it a 9 out of 10, and a very easy unit to include in multiples if you want to, particularly around a Hive Tyrant. Otherwise, for punchy Tyranid firepower though, we've got the walking battle tank that is the Tyrannocyte, 200 points worth of durable Tyranid monster. This one certainly has the armor plating to match a battle tank. 16 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save is a pretty indomitable stat line. Weapons that aren't dedicated anti-tank aren't going to do too much to that, and it's got one of those special rules that allows you to blank a damage once per game, so you could basically mitigate the damage of say a single Tau railgun shot or other similar equivalent in another army. Its most popular weapon is the Rupture Cannon, 2 attacks at strength 18, AP 4 and damage d6 +6 with heavy. and that makes for a fairly gloriously swingy profile. It could well kill a tank in one shot or do absolutely nothing if it rolls badly, but does still add up to being one of the scariest Tyranid anti-tank range damage dealers, an area where Tyranids have generally been considered to struggle a fair bit. Otherwise, some people like to use the acid spray as well, another good loadout, and that means that he can slog towards the mid-board. It means the opponents may be more likely to have to deal with that heavy defensive profile, and it can have some good overwatch against enemy Space Marines and equivalents. And in general, like the Exocrine, it can work pretty well thrown into just about any Tyranid detachment. It'll enjoy the re-rolls and redeploys to get lines of sight from subterranean assault. Invasion Fleet could get in some lethal hits and feel no pain as a 1 CP stratagem, maybe handed out for free by a friendly Hive Tyrant, and has some good stuff for Crusher Stampedes. For any of them though, it can just be lurking in the backfield, dealing out some powerful range damage dealing, both being really quite hard to take down, but also hard to ignore if the enemy's got any hard targets. I'd say the biggest downsides are the damage output of the Rupture Cannon is really quite swingy. It might do something or nothing and could reward the opponent command re-rolling an invulnerable save, and if the opponent doesn't have some really big chunky tough tanks and things, it maybe has the danger of being ignored if it's only going to be doing 2 shots and not having enough impact. For anti-tank duties though, it's certainly intimidating with some good defense on the damage and defensive side of things. Despite the downsides, I've given him a 9 out of 10. Next up, we've got the great big burrowing beastie that is the Trigon. 140 points for a Tyranid monster that's going to burst at you from below the earth. This guy can deep strike and can do so at a close range if it makes sense to, dropping in just 6 inches away from the enemy. When it gets there, it's got a fair amount of wounds, and really quite a fun punchy damage dealer profile. 12 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3. That should be enough to do some hefty damage to Marine or Terminator equivalents. It's got a little bit of shooting at range with some damage 1 as a small bonus, and in particular it's become very relevant recently. With the subterranean assault, it has the burrower keyword, so that allows you to use far more of the detachment synergies and also create tunnel markers when it comes in, delivering units into melee at close range. That detachment also has the Trigon Prime enhancement, which is well worth it. That gives you Synapse and +1 strength, so effectively jumps up from strength 9 to strength 11, which is quite a big deal, and also hitting on a 2+ is very nice indeed. Providing Synapse while also tunnel support is also really quite a good thing for nearby Tyranids charging. Otherwise, it does feel less strong outside of the subterranean assault detachment, at least relative to other monsters out there. Its damage and defense are okay. The close deep strike is kind of fun, though it is a bit annoying that it means that it's not super easy to deliver the Trigon into close combat with that, given that you can't charge in the same turn. You'd have to choose between some utility and damage output, and deciding whether or not the opponent's just going to kill it in return to use that. Overall, maybe a trickier one to rate. I've given it an 8 out of 10. I'd probably say better than that in Subterranean Assault, but a bit worse elsewhere. It is a very relevant detachment though, given it's probably the strongest Tyranid one right now. For its dual build devouring equivalent, we've got the Morlock. This one's got a similar sort of offering with the same stat line, but trading out the special rules and damage profile. The Morlock costs 5 points more, and rather than having close deep strike, it gives you a splash effect of mortal wounds nearby, usually D3 mortal wounds, though on a 5+ for each enemy unit that you roll, you can deal 3. That is a way that it could have a potentially pretty big impact, particularly if there's lots of enemy units that can get within that range of greater than 9 inches but less than 12. After that though, it's nowhere near as threatening as the Trigon when it's on the board. It does have lots of attacks, but only at strength 8, AP 2, damage 1, as opposed to the Trigon's strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3. Again, it'll also enjoy the Subterranean Assault. It can be useful in Vanguard Invader as well. Both of those have stratagems to allow you to return to reserve, allowing for more deep strike mortal wound punches and also creating tunnels for subterranean. For weaknesses, the mortal wound impact might be better against certain armies than others. It's quite a nice rule, but it might just add up to say D3 mortal wounds on one enemy unit for a 145 point unit, which is pretty bad. We'll have the choice between say getting multiple units but having to position them in a bad way. The damage output does compare pretty horribly with the Trigon once it's on the board, and it doesn't have a fun Morlock Prime enhancement for the equivalent of the Trigon. Between all of that, Trigons get played vastly more than the Morlocks. I've given him a 6 out of 10, not completely unusable, but a bit matchup dependent, and he does feel pretty directly inferior to me. Again, maybe rate a little better in Subterranean, and a little worse than this elsewhere. Next up, we've got some of the Tyranid alpha predators with the Norns, single-minded destruction organisms generated by the Hive Mind when they just have to achieve one critical objective, destroying one thing or taking one valuable resource. Out of the two of them, the Norn Emissary is a lot more played. It's 260 points and gets really quite a big chunky stat line, 16 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save. The Emissary specifically also gets a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, and either of them can get a 5+ feel no pain and OC 15 when they're in range of one nominated midfield point chosen at the start of the game. It means it can really put the onus on the opponent to deal with that if they just rock up to the mid-board and stand on it, likely taking that objective with really quite a big durable and threatening model until they manage to bring it down. Then it's got some fairly nice general purpose threat, 3 range profiles at 18 inches, which means it's almost guaranteed to do some good damage, including a powerful strength 12 melter weapon. And then it's got some fairly solid melee that really benefited from when Synapse gained an extra pip of strength, 6 attacks at strength 10 damage 3, plus an additional 4 at strength 8 damage 2. Depending on the exact matchup and how you think the game will unfold, you might have the option to sacrifice the OC and feel no pain for big rerolls against one unit if you can be pretty guaranteed that they're going to get into that squad, and that's going to be more impactful. I'd probably take the objective grabbing one as the default though. Otherwise, it does provide Synapse and could be good in Synaptic Nexus for the reroll stratagem. It's got good stuff from most of the detachments though: Invasion Fleet damage buffs and feel no pain when not on objectives, Crusher Stampede monster things, Subterranean melee delivery. It's generally pretty powerful and easy to use. For downsides, I'd say its stats add up to solid and strong, but not quite auto-include so. Maybe not quite as standout as certain range damage dealers like the Tyrannofex or Exocrine. The psychic keyword can be a downside against some enemies out there, and you might have some difficult choices to make as to whether or not it stays on its nominated midfield objective scoring points or goes after the next threat and destroys something else. Overall though, I'd certainly rated it as a solidly strong Tyranid unit. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. Next up for its brother, we've got the Norn Assimilator. This one is slightly more expensive, 15 points more at 275, and largely does most of the same things with a similar stat line, and the same big special rule of either feel no pain and OC versus big rerolls. The main advantage that you get for taking one is that its melee is pretty significantly better. It still gets the claw attacks of the other one, though trades the bonus strength 8 and damage 2 ones for far more punchy strength 12 AP 3 and damage d6 plus 1. This one's just fairly enormously better against killing tough stuff in melee, as well as that its shooting attack can get you a +2 to charge against monsters or vehicles, which could reduce its threat range. Compared with the Emissary though, it does have quite a few downsides. It doesn't have the 4+ invulnerable save, which could be pretty relevant against things like melter weapons. The ranged attacks of the Emissary are a fair bit more flexible. The anti-tank profile is kind of similar, but the Emissary's got other modes too. It's got a higher points cost versus the Norn Emissary, and between all that, it's just considered a bit directly inferior by most people. Even if I would argue it's maybe not quite as far behind as people might put it, the upgrade in the melee damage is pretty enormous. I still give it a 6.5 out of 10 overall though. It just feels like maybe a slight downgrade for being a bit more expensive. I've given it a 6.5 out of 10. I still consider him pretty usable though. Next up, we've got the Tyranid dedicated transport drop pod in the Tyrannocyte. 105 points for a great big Spore thing that drops you onto the board turn 1 if it desires. You can either transport up to 20 models or 6 multi-wound ones, or a smaller monster up to a size of 12 wounds. The idea would be for the points premium to get that unit in a good position, either dealing damage or in a threatening position in the board to either do objectives or damage after that. And then the pod itself can then go on to be a nuisance unit. It does have a fair few attacks, with 11 attacks total with AP -1 and damage 2. That's between its range and melee. It's got an 8-inch movement with fly. OC2 can do a little bit of objective work with some secondaries, and it's not completely trivial to take down as well. 10 wounds at toughness 9 with a 4+ save is going to take at least a bit of focused fire. Between getting at one unit into an advantageous position straight away and then being an annoyance chaff unit after that, it definitely does have some value. I feel like perhaps the main issue for the Tyrannocyte though is that there's not really that much that wants to buy first turn deep strike at a big premium. Tyranids just don't really have that many close range high damage shooting units that would be the ideal thing to use out after this, and due to transport rules and not having the wording of the new style Space Marine drop pod, you can't charge out of it either, which is a downside for melee monsters. Maybe Pyrovores or Zoanthropes could be good on paper, but Zoanthropes have kind of alright range in the first place, so aren't quite so dependent on this, and Pyrovores don't have huge amounts of threat. I feel like as a result you may be using it more to position a monster for a next turn threat or something like that, which just feels a bit more niche. Overall, I've given it a 4 out of 10. Very rare to see these used in any sort of strong list, even if it can do some interesting things between first turn deep strike and then being a nuisance unit after that. Sticking with the spores, next up we have the Mucilid Spore and the Spore Mines, basically living ordnance to drift down upon the enemy army, get in the way of their advance, and maybe explode for some damage. Both of these can be spawned by other units, though if you buy them in individually, a Mucilid Spore is 30 points or 60 for 2 of them, and Spore Mines are weirdly 55 points for a small squad, 110 points for a big. For advantages, as a datasheet, they're a deep strike nuisance unit that can still do certain secondaries, as mentioned with the Biovore, things like engage on all fronts and behind enemy lines. They can prevent advancing near them, which occasionally can be very big for stopping enemies getting to certain objectives, or stopping them getting into melee with advance and charge so easily. Every so often they might do a little bit of damage as a bonus. Buying them in as an actual datasheet though has all kinds of weaknesses. The damage is super low for the points cost, even if it does trigger, which won't be guaranteed. The Tyranids have got loads of competition for cheaper utility units that don't auto-explode. For example, Rippers are 25 points, so cheaper than either of these, and have got more durability. Never mind the added value of stuff that has some OC. That's another big weakness if you can't do any primaries or actions. Between all that, they just don't really do that much for the points cost, and you can just spawn them for Biovores far more efficiently. I guess out of any of these, maybe a single Mucilid for 30 points could give you another Deep Striker to prevent advance on another side of the board if that was a big deal. It's definitely paying a premium for doing so, and there's lots of other Tyranid small skirmish units that can give good utility. Overall, I've given them a 2 out of 10. Realistically, people just don't tend to buy these in as individual units, they're more kind of placeholder data sheets for other things spawning them. Lastly, for Spore things, we've got the Tyranid Fortification style creature, which is the Spore Assist. As with most fortifications in Warhammer 40k, it's kind of spectacularly expensive at 145 points, and that gets you a small, not so very durable monstrous creature. Spitting out a bit of heavy bolter style range damage, and can spawn a Mucilid Spore out to 18 inches once per turn to give a bit of the utility that Biovores can. The main weakness is the Spore Assist is just so vastly inferior to the Biovore for efficiency. It's 3 times the cost and spawns that mine at a much closer range, but still that could be an extra 5 nuisance units generated over the course of the game and help out with board control and preventing advances and objectives and things like that. In reality though, it needs to be far closer to a Biovore's points cost to really think about taking one. It's not really that durable for the cost, it doesn't really have that much damage, and it's immobile so you can't position it, and it also doesn't have any OC of its own. As a result, very rarely seen, but I could still see this being a nuisance to an enemy army advancing, maybe set it up out of line of sight and just have those spore mines project board control and a bit of damage in the area of its control. If they ever do come round to meet it, it can do some free overwatch and maybe a little damage of its own. Overall, I've given it a 3.5 out of 10. Realistically, I think it should be a fair bit cheaper than this. Next up, we've got the Winged Tyranid aircraft, and first there's the Harpy. These get hover aircraft keywords, so you could either have it swooping around and seeing things over the tops of ruins, or more likely starting it on the board and getting a 20-inch movement with fly. It's got a little bit of shooting, an even smaller amount of melee, though its main trick is its spore mine bombs, either spawning units of mines over a position where it's passed, or doing a bunch of mortal wounds to an enemy unit that you can move over, and you can move over them and then move back. The downsides though, its defense is bad for the cost, and so is its damage. It pays far too much of a premium for its speed to be good, and the spore mine spawning isn't done in quite as helpful a way as either the Biovore or the Spore Assist, as you're not able to project them out over a much further distance. OC0 means that it can't hold primaries or do actions, which definitely limits it as a fast-moving rush unit. And as an aircraft, it's unlikely to get any help from Games Workshop in 10th edition. They seem to have decided that they should be very niche indeed. Overall, I've given it a 2.5 out of 10. Very weak indeed for the points cost compared with anything else. Otherwise, it's not so very different from the Hive Crone. That one's a little cheaper and loses the spore mine spawning and the bombs. Instead, it gets a damage buff against fly units, some different damage profiles with a dual cannon torrent, plus some tentaclids for some anti-vehicle stuff, and just a tiny bit more melee with the thorax spur. Overall, basically the same weaknesses as the Harpy: low damage, low defense, OC 0, and unlikely to get any buffs. I rate this one kind of similarly, if not lower. At least the Spore Mines is an interesting ability that the Harpy can do that's a bit different to other things out there. Lastly, for the monstrous sections, we've got the Forge World Titanic monstrous creatures, and first up there's the Nid Dragon Harridan. This one's a great big resin model that's a Titanic monstrous aircraft unit, 610 points to field 1 in game, and some big power trip dire bio cannons. 2 sets of D6 plus 6, strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3 shots that have some pretty long range and get a +1 to wound against their chosen targets if you take D3 mortal wounds on a 2+. It should be hard for the opponents to avoid getting shot by those, given it's got good movement to get line of sight. If enemies get too close to the Harridan, it does have a small amount of melee as well. 6 attacks at strength 14 and damage D6, though maybe not loads to write home about for a monstrous creature of this sort of size and points investment. And basically, as a massive Tyranid unit that's far more points than almost anything else you can field, it'll be super efficient for any single unit buffs or stratagems, say that 5+ feel no pain in invasion fleets. It's also got a fun transport capacity for gargoyles if desired, though I feel like they're just probably best off just running separately. For downsides, its defense really isn't good for 610 points. 30 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save means that if the opponent's got some long range, heavy hitting anti-tank, then it could go down pretty depressingly quickly for 610 points. and just about any model of this sort of size and points investment needs to do a lot of work to really justify its investment. In reality, I think Tyranids lists are almost always going to be doing better, taking this unit's points in multiple other units. Again, being a flyer aircraft, OC0 doesn't really help so much for such a big important model. Not being able to put some big weight on mid-board objectives towards the end of the game is a downside when this is quite a big significant chunk of your army. Overall, I've given it a 3.5 out of 10. Realistically not very good, but pretty fun when they do take to the table. And against certain armies it could be surprisingly annoying and hard to deal with. Long-range, fast-moving weapons that hit very, very hard. And if you can manage to keep it alive and dealing damage to meaningful things for the whole game, it's possible it could do okay. I've given it a 3.5 out of 10 though. For the other great big Tyranid Forge World beast, we've got the Hierophant Biotitan. This massive Tyranid four-legged construct costs 810 points, so even more of an enormous chunk of your army list than the Harridan is. Again, it's got those fairly general purpose dire biocannons, though unfortunately this one comes without the +1 to wound debuff that you can give them, so isn't going to be quite as strong against toughness 11 or higher. It does cost far more points, but it's got a far more intimidating stat line to take down. In particular, its toughness 14, so a lot of las cannon equivalents are going to be wounding it on a 5 rather than a 3 versus the Harridan, and then has 30 wounds with a 2+ save and a 5+ invulnerable. It can transport Tyranid infantry models, and with such a big defensive stat line, it could be a good way for them to get an alpha strike. It has some melee and a bioplasma attack as well, and again will be very efficient for any single buffs or stratagems. Again though, like the Harridan, realistically the damage and defense just aren't good for 810 points, maybe particularly not compared with its equivalent weight in Tyrannocytes and Exocrines. And if you want the army strength, you're better off investing in just lots of other Tyranid monstrous creatures rather than one enormous one. Its big profile could be pretty hard to move around the board as well, and isn't great on any sort of locked terrain. I guess maybe Crusher Stampede could be an option to allow it to move just that bit more freely, or again Invasion Fleet could be interesting for the Feel No Pain stratagem. Overall though, realistically it's not very strong. I've given it a 3 out of 10 here. Finally, we're on to the Tyranid characters, HQs and commanders. I'll talk through most of them here, though I have talked about the lone operative ones already in the section earlier. First up, we've got the standard walking Hive Tyrant. He's 195 points for a monster character unit, perhaps the archetypical big bad guy central leader beast of the army. He gives you a sort of medium durability monstrous creature, 10 wounds with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, a bit of range and melee damage, maybe with a heavy venom cannon plus a bone sword, though perhaps he's best for his leadership abilities. He gives you a cheaper stratagem once per battle round within 12 inches. That's pretty good just about anywhere, though it's nice enough for things like a 5+ Feel No Pain and Invasion Fleet, or maybe giving a Tyrannocyte a handy command point reroll or two. And then on top of that, he helps out Tyranid shooting in quite a big way, giving you an aura of an assault and lethal hits, which is pretty excellent for Exocrines in particular. Having them move around the board faster to gain lines of sight, and getting lethal hits to punch up against stuff is a really nice combo. Then he can chip in with his own damage dealing, and he can be a good model for enhancements, particularly durability ones, say the Feel No Pain one from Invasion Fleet. You could run him with Hive Guard if desired as well. For Alpha Leader Beast for the Tyranids, he does have some pretty solid competition both from the Swarm Lord and the Winged Hive Tyrant, which depending on the detachment and army could both be the preferred choice. It does feel like he maybe isn't quite as pivotal as he once used to be, now that his free stratagems are just once per battle round as opposed to twice. If he does get exposed, his damage and defense aren't really all that impressive for the point, though you are expecting him to pay a premium for his buffing abilities, and he maybe feels just a little bit less vital in Subterranean Assault, which is quite popular right now, with other ways to get Tyranid firepower and damage dealers around the board. Overall still a strong unit though. I've given him an 8 out of 10, a pretty valuable addition to most armies, though maybe not an absolutely auto-include one. Otherwise, we've got his counterpart in the sky, the Winged Tyrant. He's got a similar kind of stat line and a fairly similar offering. Obviously he flies and has deep strike and faster movement. He still has that discounted command point aura. His damage profile is maybe a little weaker, getting Tyrant Talons in addition to one major weapon. I'd say a special rule isn't quite as impactful as well, giving you a -1 to the number of attacks that an enemy unit has, which is useful but maybe not quite as easy to use or as reliable as the lethal hits and assault. He does have the advantage of being 25 points cheaper than the regular on-foot Tyrant though, and with the Vanguard Invader keyword he's a pretty big deal for that detachment, perhaps particularly with the ability to turn off shooting to him at a long range. For downsides, he is a little less tough and threatening than the on-foot Winged Tyrant, and he does lose the Onslaught buff, which is a huge amount of value, particularly for Onslaught. The regular on-foot Tyrant does tend to get taken a fair bit more. So if you're not running a battery of Tyranid firepower, then this guy could be a bit more tempting, particularly in Vanguard Onslaught. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10 overall. I'd go higher in that detachment though. Finally, for the trio of Tyrants that you can build from the one kit, there's the Swarm Lord, Alpha Strategist of the Tyranids, and spawned in when there's next level threats to respond to. He certainly rose up in the rankings a fair bit recently when he dropped in points quite a bit when the other Hive Tyrants did, but didn't take the nerf to the stratagems that they had. He's now a 220 point monster with a similar profile to the on foot Hive Tyrant, though better melee. He's got a big 8 attacks at strength 10, AB 2 and damage 3, all with twin linked, plus a synaptic pulse torrent attack to fry a few infantry, so you certainly have to respect his melee. His really big value comes from his command point abilities though. He just flat out generates you 1 command point per battle round when he's on the battlefield, so pretty nice for any of the detachments that really want to be using their stratagems to the max. And if he's nearby the enemy as well, then he can give you an aura of increasing the command point costs for enemy stratagems nearby. That can be really quite disruptive, particularly if he's in range of enemy units that are fighting hard in the midboard. Finally, he is also Synapse and gets a boosted Synapse aura as well, so pretty helpful to have as part of an advance and could get you the strength buff or any other benefits that it might bring in your detachment. Overall, it looks like since the last points cost, he seems to have risen up in terms of tournament play massively. He can get on well with most detachments. The Subterranean Assault could be a nice way to deliver him into melee, and it's quite nice to see him looking usable and scary again. Again, for his biggest downside, he's not that durable for his big points cost. 10 wounds at toughness 10 definitely means that you want to play cagey for him, maybe have a few turns of command point shenanigans, then commit to the fight in the midboard unless you're doing something with Tyrant Guard. The challenge is generally going to be to get both use out of his buffing abilities and also his melee profile at some point in the game. Overall, I'd rate him as a strong model, though not necessarily auto-include. I've given him an 8 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Alpha Brain Bug that is the Neuro Tyrant, really quite a fun Eldritch Horror model, first coming out in the Leviathan box set. This one's 105 points and gives you a bunch of different value in different areas really. One of the most simple and direct ones is that it gives you an army-wide debuff to enemy leadership tests for Shadow in the Warp, and that means that when that triggers, a lot more units are going to be failing morale tests. That ability is definitely going to be worth a few points. It could help prevent stratagems or a few victory points from time to time. You could see that as being worth X amount of points in its own right, and then essentially after that you have a pretty cheap and somewhat expendable monster once that's done, that can add a fair bit of extra value to the army. It can help out with Synapse at longer range, with those Neuraloids being able to be dispatched to keep units in Synapse range that are further away. That's definitely helpful. It's got a fairly close range but nicely punchy and damage to torrent attack, which could melt some enemy infantry units getting nearby. I've often seen them used to guard the home field and torrent down things that come in from reserves. It's not mandatory to put him with Zoanthropes, though you certainly can do if you'd like to. He improves their damage output and gives them big guns never tire as well, so you can have really quite a powerful psychic shooting battery. Overall, he provides a bunch of value in different areas, easy to use in most attachments, maybe particularly good if you're in Synaptic Nexus, whereas torrent damage can be a lot better for a cheap enhancement, or maybe pairing with Lictors, perhaps in Vanguard Onslaught, to help more enemies fail their leadership tests and activate their buffs. Overall, between all that is a lot of value. It's not really going to be particularly threatening against tougher stuff if he gets paired up against that. It seems that the majority of Tyranid lists feel like he's worth the include, though not absolutely everyone. Overall, I've given him an 8.5 out of 10, definitely a powerful choice to put on the tabletop. Next up, we've got the regenerating Carnifex that is Old One-Eye, an epic hero Tyranid character for 150 points, and basically the best chance of making Carnifexes good. Per point is a fair bit tougher than the standard Carnifexes, getting a 5+ feel no pain and regenerating wounds if he's injured but not killed. He's got far more threatening melee than Carnifexes, with strength 14, AB 3, and damage D6+1 on his attacks, and if he leads a unit of them, then he gets to reroll all hit rolls, both for himself and the allied Carnifexes. It does feel like that's the best way of making them efficient, given that when they're hitting on a 4+, they really struggle for damage. It could be nice enough in Crusher Stampedes to access some of their stratagems, or Subterranean Assault to deliver them to melee perhaps. For his main downside, I feel like he's held back by the power of Carnifexes right now. As a melee monster with a lowish move, he might well get screened or ignored for a turn or two. Unless you have some special way of getting him into melee, such as the Subterranean detachment, you are kind of incentivized to take him in a big 390 point unit with 2 Carnifexes to make maximal use of his buffs, but then the unit gets quite big and clunky, and the overall melee offering is competing with a whole bunch of other melee damage dealers for Tyranids, such as the Auspex or the Norn Emissary for example, plus all the range damage dealers that you could get for a similar points cost. Overall, I've given him a 6.5 out of 10, mainly because I feel like he's held back by the datasheet strength of the Carnifexes right now. If they were better, then he would be. That's maybe a bit borderline whether to go for a 6.5 or 7. His own rules definitely do have some interest. Next up, we've got the Gaunt spawning broodmother that is the Turvigon, 175 points for the dual build kit for the Tyrannifex, a great big Tyranid HQ that can spawn termagants onto the battlefield. For the points cost, it's very tanky indeed. 16 wounds at toughness 11 and a 2+ save is very tanky for that cost. The primary rule that it gets is respawning D3+3 termagants into a unit, which means that if the opponent damages a big squad of 20 of them but doesn't manage to wipe them out, they can ping back with a vengeance, and potentially do so in addition to other replenishing things like invasion fleets. For damage buffs, it gives you lethal hits on the ranged weapons for nearby termagants, which can certainly help them do a bit more chip damage, maybe with some spine fists perhaps. It does have a bit of damage threat of its own, a few close range flesh borer style shots, and then some melee. It's very bad damage output for the points, but attacks that do it land home will hit at least fairly big. It's strength 12, AP 3 and damage D6+1 in close combat. Otherwise it provides synapse, and if you're going very heavy on the swarmy Tyranids, maybe playing something like Unending Swarm, it can help the damage output of those termagants feel a lot less trivial. For downsides though, its melee and range damage is just very bad for its cost. It's certainly paying more for its utility abilities. The respawning termagants thing is kind of dependent on the big termagant squads being good to start with. It's not really the way that most people choose to run them these days, and it is rather dependent on having a squad that's still surviving but partially destroyed, and the opponent might be able to just focus down and one round them potentially. I guess in a full-on swarm army it can stick out a bit as a target for anti-tank weapons, though given it is quite so durable it might not be the worst problem in the world. Lethal hits might have some overlap with invasion fleets if you're using that detachment for respawning gaunts. If you happen to be taking that anyway against monsters and vehicles, then its main damage buff might not do that much. And again, maybe a bit unfortunate that the Unending Swarm is pretty weak due to the rules nerfs that Games Workshop's given it. Overall, as a result, it's pretty rare to see Tervagons on the board in competitive lists, even if they do have some fun rules and some fairly chunky defense. If these walking battle tank things are being played at the moment, it's generally as Tyrannofexes. I've given the Tervagon a 5 out of 10 overall for in-game power. Next up, we've got the Wings Prime, making a starring appearance in the Leviathan trailer, ripping apart a Terminator. This guy costs 65 points and can either join warrior squads or gargoyles. Its main buff is to give the unit sustained hits, so it does amp up their damage. It chips in with a bunch of strength 6 damage 2 attacks and provides synapse to the unit as well. And if it joins a warrior squad, it can be the way to get them the Vanguard Invader keyword for Vanguard Onslaught, allowing them advance and charge in that detachment and access to other stratagems. Otherwise it could give you the option to make an unusual sort of partly skirmishy gargoyle squad with a little bit of actual damage, which could be interesting on a unit with their movement rules, though generally tends to be not considered worth it. It is also just a cheap model with deep strike and synapse. It's maybe not completely out of the question that you could run it solo, but again Tyranids have just got an enormous amount of cheap units for that sort of skirmishy style role. For the downsides, its damage output just isn't particularly exciting. Its durability is pretty low for any attacks that actually go into it. It doesn't get any sort of invulnerable save. It's usually seen as an overinvestment for gargoyles, and it's maybe held back a bit by the outright power of melee warriors. They've generally been in a place where they're kind of okay but not so stand out throughout most of 10th edition. Overall I'd rate him as usable, and you can add him on to melee warriors. I feel like alongside them and Vanguard he's interesting enough. Even there though, for mainline damage dealers for that detachment, you've got some big rivals including Gene Stealers and the hyper-adapted Raveners. Talking of which, next up we have the Broodlord. He's the Gene Stealer in chief for 80 points. He moves fast alongside his Brood with an 8-inch scout move and then 8-inch moves normally. They provide a whole bunch of accurate high AP horde clearance attacks, and he'll make them into a more well-rounded damage threat, putting them up to strength 5 with synapse, having his own profile with a bunch of twin linked attacks with AP 2 and damage 2, and giving the entire squad devastating wounds as well, so any 6s that you do get punched straight through armor saves. Between all that, he transforms his unit into one that's better against lighter infantry, to one that can genuinely deal some meaningful damage even against tough stuff, perhaps particularly an invasion fleet with access to sustained or lethal hits. On top of that, he also debuffs enemy units to have -1 to hit in the fight phase, and while he does enjoy invasion fleet, he's even more standout in Vanguard Onslaught. Getting advance and charge is really nice there, and the squad has got lots of interesting supporting stratagems. I'd likely rate him slightly higher if specifically using that detachment. For the downsides, he does pay a premium for the big scout moves and the getting into melee fairly straightforwardly. If you bring him in a 10-man squad, you are paying quite a lot of points for a unit and something that isn't quite as sacrificial anymore, and a squad that will be able to deal some good damage to things, but might just about limp into dealing with things like mainline battle tanks in a single round of melee, as opposed to doing so easily. And if they do just charge straight to the front of the enemy army and try and tear something apart, they are going to get hit back very hard, and they're not really that tough. Overall though, between him and the Gene Stealers, they're both quite solid. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Finally, for the many and varied bioforms of the Tyranids, we have the hyper-adapted Raveners. They're the representation of the Kill Team version of Raveners with their interesting biomorph upgrades, and Games Workshop gave them really quite a cool 40k datasheet that gives you a few interesting ways to use them. They're 165 points, so quite a big investment for basically a Tyranid Ravener command squad. In the unit you get a Tyranid Prime who has the Synapse keyword. He gets twice the attacks and twice the defense of the regular ones, and compared with the regular Raveners they have just a lot more melee damage. They get anti-monster and anti-vehicle 5+, which with their general purpose talents with twin linked means they'll be wounding those most of the time, plus the entire squad has sustained hits as well, so you can have quite a lot more hits to roll at the enemy to start with. Between all that, that's really quite general purpose damage output. They also have a venom bolt to be spat out of the one with the ranged weapon, and when they turn up from the underground they have a free rapid ingress to do so she'll be able to guarantee the alpha strike on one enemy unit, turning up out of line of sight and using good movement to get some short charges. They can certainly be useful just by themselves, though otherwise you have the option to make a big alpha unit of Raveners with these guys and the regular ones added in, and that means that you'll be able to return to reserves and the regular Raveners will be able to benefit from the sustained hits from this unit and the free rapid ingress. That sort of unit almost feels like next level Gene Stealers in a way. Really quite a lot of massive damage threat, but again they're going to be a unit that could charge up to the enemy, deal a bunch of damage and then get hit back very hard in return. They're pretty excellent in both Subterranean Assault and Vanguard Onslaught though, given that they have the keywords to be relevant for both detachments, creating tunnels and things or getting advance and charge and access to return to reserves there. For their downsides, they do feel a bit detachment dependent for their strength. As mentioned, they're not very durable for the cost, and even with rapid ingress, you might still get screened out of tough targets, particularly if you're going with the big 10-man squad and the enemy really sees it coming. It's a pretty big unit footprint to try and land somewhere as well. There just might not be room for them unless the opponent's left some really big gaps. Overall, I've given them an 8 out of 10 though. I think they're a solid and interesting unit. I'd rate them maybe a little higher than that in Subterranean Assault, a little lower elsewhere. With the Tyranid characters talked about though, that's just about it for this one. Let me know your thoughts as to the datasheets down in the comments below. Which Tyranid organisms are making their way into your army these days, and let me know any other insights and takes. Would you have rated anything higher or lower here, or any other cool uses that you've found for the units? Finally, I'll just sign off with a shout out for objectivemarkers.com once again. As mentioned earlier, they're a UK based maker of faction themed objective markers for 40k. Clear plastic discs that measure out the distance of whether or not units are on objectives or not, and add a bit of faction theme with their iconography. There's some that could be nice enough for the Tyranids and plenty of other 40k races. You can check them out, links down in the video description below. They ship out to the UK and USA currently. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.